Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So I want to make, thank you. I want to make a general comment and say that in some ways, since I started this series a few years ago, and I had read Rashi on the Torah quite a number of times and even given classes on the Torah, but never as consistently as I have been privileged to do, and it is a privilege on Zoom with all of you. I think I am much more aware in the line of the more you know how little you know, how much I don't know. And on the other hand, I'm very grateful for what I do know, and the fact that you're present or watching this is an indication that you feel that what I have to say and share is worthwhile, whether on account of my background and knowledge or whether on account of whatever God allows me to understand and interpret in a way that I hope is significant. But one of the reasons I'm saying this to share this with you is that the material we are dealing with now gets into, it's more of the issues that have to do with the legal ramifications of being a Kohen and the level of purity involved, and it's all been subject to very, very careful analysis, and I'm going to do my best as best as I understand it to share this analysis for you and hope that you find it interesting. So with that in mind, I will go into the screen share with you. So we're finishing up at this point, chapter 21, as you can see. And here we are, we'll read verse 21. And it's been continuing essentially in this chapter of Emor. We read about who the priest initially is allowed to become impure for in the case of death, losing a close relative. We read about various physical deformities that may render a priest ineligible to offer up sacrifices on the altar. These are issues that we dealt with the last time we read about these sorts of things. So this is just finishing up the idea. So, Kol Ish Asher
Rabbi, we didn't. If you had something important to say, you have to say it again because you cut out. Your sound cut out.
At what point, Lauren?
We didn't hear the last minute or so.
Really? So
Yeah.
what was the last thing you heard?
That you appreciate, studying this again and again, and I assume you appreciate it if you're tuning in, and and then you said something else, and that we didn't get.
Okay, so oh yes, all right. So what I said was the material that we're dealing with now has been analyzed very, very carefully in the Sifra and in the Talmud, and Rashi is sharing with us the basis of this analysis. We've had this kind of Rashi before, and of course it requires very close study, etc. And I will do the best I can to explain it as best as I understand it. So what's happened is that since I've had to be more rigorous in sharing this with you, as opposed to just studying it by myself, I recognize to a greater extent the challenge that it presents me as I try to present it. That's essentially what I was saying. So, and then of course I talked a little bit about the fact that we've been discussing those elements that render a priest ineligible to actually serve and minister at the altar. So we're coming to the conclusion of this section. Kol ish asher bo mum, any man in whom there is a blemish, mizera Aharon HaKohen, from the steed of Aaron the priest, lo yigash, should not draw near, lahakriv et Ishe Hashem, in order to offer up the fire offerings of Hashem. Mum bo, there is a blemish in him. Et lechem Elohav, the food, and Rashi's going to tell us that the word lechem, which we most often translate as bread, refers to any kind of food, the food of his God, lo yigash lahakriv. He should not bring it near to offer it up. And this sentence, of course, is going to get some interpretation. So, kol ish asher bomim, any man in whom there is a blemish. But we've already mentioned a bunch of blemishes specifically. So Rashi says, and this is from Torat Kohanim, from the Sifra, Lerabot, this is to come to include Sha'ar, other mumim, other blemishes. In other words, blemishes that haven't been specified in the Torah to this point. This sentence comes to include as well as rendering the Kohen ineligible or unfit to minister at the altar. Mum bo, his blemish is within him. So again, question is, why is this said? Didn't we just say this? So this is how we interpret this particular statement. It's really, I think, very interesting. But od mumo bo pasul. That is to say that as long as that blemish is in him, okay, or on him, he is ineligible. Ha im avar mumo. So consequently, if that particular blemish gets healed, if it no longer is there on him, kasher, it's appropriate for him then. So it isn't a permanent situation. There are certain blemishes, of course, that may be permanent blemishes, but there are other blemishes that might be there. For example, I'll suggest, for example, a wart, which could in fact get healed, get removed and healed, that would be what we're talking about here. Lechem Elohav, so the bread of his God, and Rashi tells us, Kol ma'achal karui lechem. Any kind of food is called lechem. We use that term, lechem. So there's a little example of that kind of analysis that I was referring to. So, and again, repeating this phrase, lechem Eloham, the bread of his God, mikodshei hakodashim, from those most sanctified, objects, umin hakodashim, and from the sanctified ones, yochel, he can eat, he shall eat. And we already know from having studied these things that there were certain offerings, many of them, that the priest actually consumed. There were parts of that offering that were there and reserved for the priest to consume, and that was part of the service of that offering. We know that when it came to an olah, which is sometimes translated as a burnt offering or a whole offering, there the entire animal essentially was sacrificed. And the only part that went to the priest was the skin, which was, or the hide of the animal.
God.
So what's the problem? Harlan, did you make a comment? Is everything okay?
Speaker's going up.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad it's nothing worse than that. Okay.
Can't hear you.
All right. You cannot hear me? Okay. All right. Well, it's being recorded, so hopefully you'll get that sorted out. Mikodshei hakodashim. So what do we mean by the most sanctified objects? Elu kodshei hakodashim. So this phrase is referring to those sacrifices that are called kodshei kodshim. So, for example, the sin offering and I'm sorry, I'm blocking on it, but basically, and the whole offering, right? There were certain sacrifices that were defined in that way. There were also kodshim kalim, which were not of the most sacred, okay, that were also offered up. So, min hakodashim yochal, right? And from the holy offerings, he should eat. yochel, and that refers to kochim kalim. So it refers to the sacrifices, and I believe that, for example, a Todah offering or shlamim might have been on a lesser level, and that in that they could be slaughtered in any part of the sanctuary, and that's the point, is that there were offerings that were of lesser sanctity. Certainly things like the first fruits, or the bechorot, or the firstborn of the animals that were also offered up, those were definitely kochim kalim. So now comes a question. Ve'im ne'emru kodshei kodashim. But if in fact, if in fact he's permitted to eat the most sanctified of the offerings, lama nemru kodshim kalim, then why mention those offerings that were of less sanctity if he's allowed? That is to say, a priest who has a blemish, right? That's the point that we're making. That the Torah is saying that even though he can't offer them up on the altar, he is still entitled to a priestly portion of the most sacred offerings. So if he's allowed to eat from the most sacred offerings, why do we have to go around and say that he can eat from the less sacred offerings? If he's allowed to eat from the most sacred offerings, then for sure he should be allowed to eat from the less sacred offerings. It's just logical. So this analysis, again, Rashi, or at least the editor of Rashi is telling us, is found in these references in the Torat Kohanim, the Sifra, and in the tractate Zevachim, page 101. So, im lo ne'emru. So the answer is that were the less sacred offerings not mentioned, if the Torah didn't specifically mention those offerings that were of less sanctity, and that a priest with a blemish is allowed to eat those offerings, hayiti omer, I might conclude, bekodshei hakodashim, that when it came to the most sacred offerings, yochal ba'almun, that a person with a blemish is permitted to eat them, that because the Torah has given the person with a blemish the ability to eat those, or the permission to eat them. Why? Shematzinu shehu tru lazar, because in fact we know that there was a circumstance where such offerings, such sacred offerings, were permitted to a non-kohen, she'achal Moshe, because Moses, who was not a priest, actually partook of those offerings, bisar hamiluim. He ate from the meat of those offerings that were brought to invest Aaron and his sons into the priesthood. And Moses ate from them, and they were kodshashim. Aval bechazeh v'shok shel kodashim kalim, but when it came to the brisket and the thigh of the less sacred offerings, lo yochal, then a priest, we might say, is not a blemished priest, is not allowed to eat them, shelo matzinu zar, because in that case, cholek bahem, because we don't find any example of a non-priest being permitted to eat them. Only the most holy do we have such an example, but we have no such example when it came to those offerings of less sanctity. And that's why the Torah has to specifically tell us that the offerings of lesser holiness may be eaten by a priest who is blemished. Kach meforash b'zvachim, and that's the way it's explained in the tractate Zvachim. Again, an example of this close analysis that I mentioned to you. So let's go on. Okay. Ach el haparochet. So now again, there's a concern. Ach el haparochet. However, to the curtain that was in front of the sanctuary, lo yavo, he should not come. There were actually two curtains. There was one that separated off the holy part of the sanctuary, and then, of course, that had that part of the sanctuary that had held the menorah, where the menorah was, and the incense altar and the showbread table, they were there. And then there was another curtain that separated that off from the Holy of Holies. So he was not a blemish. We're talking again about a priest who has blemishes. So it's being a little bit more specific here, including some other places. The El HaMizbeach lo yigash, nor should he draw near the altar, ki mumbo, because there is a blemish within him. Lo yichalel et mikdashai, he should not profane my sacred objects. Okay, ki ani Hashem bekadsham, because I, the Lord, sanctify them. So an act of deep respect. So let's go to the Rashi on this. Ach el haparochet. So we've just given permission to the blemished priest to eat from the sacred animals, right, from the offerings. But it's saying now, however, he cannot draw close to the curtain. Lahazot sheva hazaot shel haparochet, to sprinkle the 7 sprinklings that were to go on that curtain. Ve'el hamizbech, nor to the altar. So the point is that there were 2 altars. There was the altar outside where they offered up the sacrifices, and of course there was the golden altar within the sanctuary itself where they offered up the incense. So what altar are we talking about? Hachitzon. So it makes sense that if he's not allowed to go within the curtain of the sanctuary where you would find the gold altar, the altar we're talking about is the one that was outside, hachitzon, the external one. Ushnehem sruchu likatev. And Rashi simply tells us here that both the issue of the curtain and the issue of the altar outside had to be written, had to be specified, umeforash b'torat kohanim, and that is explained again in the Sifra as why both are mentioned. But Rashi is not telling us any more than that here. V'lo yechalel et mikdasha. Let's make sure I've got it. Mikdashai, yes. He should not profane either my sacred objects or my sanctuaries. She'im avod uvodato. The point about this, that is, if he actually goes and he does this, it's telling us the consequences. Mechulelet lehipasel. They become so. We are presumably talking about offerings, and that if he actually offers up these offerings, that they become invalid, right? They are profaned and invalid. They no longer have the validity of what they were supposed to have. So next, Vaydaber Moshe el Aaron ve'el banav. Moses spoke to Aaron and his sons, ve'el kol b'nei Yisrael, and to the entire and all the children of Israel. That's what it says. So what did he say? What did he say? Normally, this kind of statement is followed, by what he said. So the question is, what's this referring to? Vaydaber Moshe, Moses spoke, ha-mitzvah hazot. It simply is referring back to this specific mitzvah regarding priests that have blemishes and what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. El Aharon v'gomer, he said it, told Aaron, etc. In other words, his sons, El Kol b'nei Israel, and to the entire children of Israel. So what we can understand why he'd need to tell it to Aaron and his sons, because it affected them directly. Lahazhir beit din al hakohanim. That was to warn the court, okay, that would be made up of non-priests as well as possibly priests, but they were admonished regarding the priests. That is, that they would be responsible to make sure that the priests followed these particular rules that were mentioned. Going on, unless there's some comments, because we just finished a chapter. Okay. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. So again, common way in which this starts. Hashem, the Lord, spoke. Moses saying, yes, please.
I was wondering, Rabbi, if a priest is disabled some way or other,
Mhm.
how can he perform the service then? Uh, I mean, if he's crippled with a leg or a
Mhm.
arm or something,
Right.
um, what? I mean, not a boil could disappear, but
Mhm.
a crippled leg doesn't disappear.
Right.
How? What happens to him then? Could he still eat the food?
That is
And
what,
could he?
yes.
Uh,
That is what,
but he couldn't perform the service.
correct, correct. But because he couldn't perform the service doesn't mean that he doesn't get the privileges of the priest, or
Oh,
in the sense of being able to partake of the sacrificial food, even the most holy sacrificial food. So while we don't want to put him on display, okay, because that was what was happening when the priest brought the offering, he would be essentially on display. And we didn't want to do that, possibly to humiliate him, possibly to show disrespect to God. That
hmm.
we don't need to do the best, absolute best we can in that regard. So, I mean, there are various ways in which one might approach this particular law. But I think it's very significant that such priests were still entitled to partake and to consume sacrificial food. Going on a little bit more. Daber el Aharon ve'el banav. So again, speak to Aaron and to his sons. Vayinazru mikodshev bnei Israel, that they should separate themselves from the sanctified, the sanctified food, or the sacred donations of the children of Israel. So we have to understand the context of this, and we will get to that in a moment. I just will finish up the sentence, V'lo yichalalu et shem kochi, so that they not profane my holy name. Asher hem maktishim li, which they sanctify to me, Ani Hashem, so that they possibly refers to the Israelites who are bringing their sacred offerings to the temple to be offered up. I am Hashem. I am Hashem. So there's, again, you can tell that there's going to be quite a bit to unpack here. Vayinazru. So first of all, this particular word. So we also have the word Nazir, a Nazarite. And the word Rashi is going to tell us is Ein Nazira. If we're talking about this word Nazira, Ella Prisha, what it means is to keep aloof, to separate yourself. Safaria is the one who translates Prisha as keeping aloof. You want to stay away. So that's what Nazir has to do with. And the reason a Nazir is called a Nazir is because he has to keep aloof. He has to stay away from any grape product, not just wine, but even fresh grapes or grape juice. Doesn't matter. That's why he's called a Nazir. He stays away. And also, of course, that's the essential issue. And of course, he also cannot come in contact with a corpse. He has to stay away from that as well. V'chein hu omer, and so likewise, Rashi gives us other examples. V'yinazer me'acharai. This is a general comment where it's talking about the Israelites remaining aloof from following God. And in Isaiah, Nazoru Achor, that's another example of where they went backwards. They separated themselves back from approaching God. That is in the sense of positively coming close to God and living close to God. They moved backwards. Yifreshu min hakodashim. So what's the context? They should stay away from the sacred food, sacred objects, be made tumatam during the days when the priests are in a state of impurity. So if the priests are things can happen, and a priest might become impure. At that point, they have to stay away. They can't, you'll see, they can't consume it. They can't offer up sacrifices. They have to wait until they are pure again before they can do that. And of course, this is a different kind of issue from the issues that prevented the priest from offering up sacrifices, but at the same time could nevertheless partake of them, but here under no circumstances have to stay away completely. And that's probably part of the context of Yinazru as well. Davar acher. So another interpretation. Yeah, Harlan, question?
I was wondering on Nazareth,
Yes.
he has to stay away from his burial of his parents too, like the priest.
Yes, he would.
His mother and father, he can't go to the cemetery.
Good question. Yes, if he's taken on the vow of being a Nazirite, then he cannot do these things. Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But of course, it was a temporary issue, and yeah. Davar acher, another interpretation. Ve'yinazru mikodshei bnei Israel. So he puts this. He takes a sentence and puts it into a better order. Okay, that is, they should separate from the children of Israel. That is the sanctified food items of the children of Israel, asher hamiktishim li, which they offer up to me. So in other words, clearly referring to those sacred donations of the Israelites. V'lo yechalalu et shem kodshi, and so that they do not profane my holy name. And he says, Sares v'amikra v'darshehu. So what he's saying is realign or reorder the verse, and then you can interpret it. Asher hamakdishim li, which they offer up to me, that they sanctify to me. And this is larabot. The reason why this particular phrase is added, the larabot kodshei hakohanim atzmam, and that is to include not just those that are offered up by the children of Israel, but also to include those offerings that are brought by a priest. So the priests themselves, they had to be careful not if they were in a state of impurity or became impure after they had dedicated something like, an offering, they had to stay away. They were not able to touch it. And I'm going to stop here. I think it's a good place for us to pause. And again, with God's help, we will continue this tomorrow. And I will stop the share and give you an opportunity to comment if you want. Admittedly, this material is relatively arcane if we're not familiar with it. So let me go in and stop the share. There we go. All right. Lauren, do you have any comments you want to make? No. Okay. Kathy? All right. Okay. All right. We will stop. Yeah, go ahead, Harlan.
I would say if the person that's doing a Thanksgiving or something like that,
yes,
he has the food the same day, or on the third day, he can't eat any of the food. So on the same day, if he has to eat the food, he can invite all his relatives there to eat with him, right?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe it told us. That is to say, as long as it's within the time frame in which he's allowed to eat from that Thanksgiving offering, yes. And they, of course, have to also be in a state of purity. But here we're talking specifically about the priests in the performance of their duties, that they have to be in a state of purity. So, okay, I'm going to stop the recording here.